Hello, my people! Welcome to Unit 5, Part 1. In this unit, we will be going over memory and language. And for this first video, we will be going over modules 31 through 33. All right, let's start with memory, shall we? So memory is the basis for knowing our friends, neighbors, our English language, the national anthem, yourself. If memory was non-existent, everyone would be a stranger to you. Every language would be foreign, and every task is new where we don't know through trial and error, and even knowing yourself, you would be a stranger, right? Because if we cannot store anything, what do we have to work with? What do we have to build on, right? So when we think of memory, it's the basis of who we are, right? And also the reason that we as a species are so dominant is partially due to the size of our brain and the ability to encode and retrieve, which is way more advanced than a lot of other species, right? So this is another reason why we're so high on the totem pole, because of our ability to remember and our ability to learn through trial and error, right? So cool. So the phenomena of memory, so memory is any indication that learning has persisted over time. It is our ability to store and retrieve information. So it's a big kind of bundle of a package. Memory is an indication that learning has persisted over time. Again, key part is over time. And it's our ability to store and retrieve. So store the information in our brain and our ability to take it back out and to say it out loud, right? So stages of memory. So when we think of kind of this memory model, there's three parts. There's the encoding, where the information is coming at us, where we're learning it. There's the storage section, so there's encoding, and then we have to store it in our brains. And then the hardest part is the retrieval, bringing it back out, right? So encoding, storage, and then retrieval, retrieving the information back out, okay? So here's our little sequence process. I tried to create little icons that would go, right? So encode, we first have to type, right, onto our doc. We have to store it, which a lot of people are finding is the hardest part, and then we can thus spit it out again, right? The retrieval of our information. So we have the Atkins-Shiffrin model, which is our three-stage processing model of memory. And the Atkins-Shiffrin model, so again, someone named Atkinson and Shiffrin, they came up with this model. That is right, it's their last name, right? You always want to get some credit, but it's a three-stage model of memory. It includes sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. And so we first have to have an external event, right? Like right now, you guys are listening to me on this video, right? So you are getting sensory input from me, right? Sensory, right? You're seeing it, you're hearing it. And it's now put into sensory memory, right? Where we're trying to start to attain what we're trying to understand and what we're trying to learn. And once it's in our sensory memory, and our sensory memory doesn't last that long, right? So if I were to explain, if we had a test on this right now and I just told you about it, you'd probably be able to tell me what your sensory memory has been holding right now. But your sensory memory doesn't have a lot of storage, right? So we have to start looking at, there's a new term in the Atkins-Shiffrin model, and it's called working memory. And working memory is the new term for short-term memory. So when you hear short-term memory, it is now called working memory because it is constantly trying to store and retrieve. Okay, it's always working, right? That's kind of my mnemonic. It's always working. And our working memory, its main goal is to encode it into long term. So when you are studying for a test, you're really trying to work with your working memory or your short term to try to get it into long term, right? Because long term memory there is no limit. We have not, in the human species, have said, oh, I can't take in any more information. My brain is full, right? It might feel that way, but there's no proof that our brain can be completely full, right? And so again, we have this portion of working short-term memory where we're trying to encode, but we're also trying to learn to retrieve, right? So while, during my video lectures, and not my video lectures, but when we're in class, there's a reason that I want you to try to think off the top of your head, because if you can remember it from the top of your head, that means that you have it already encoded in your long-term memory, and it's there for a while, my friends, once it's in long term, okay? So that's why we're trying to really understand what has been encoded and what hasn't yet, right? Awesome. So first, sensory memory. So now we're just gonna break it down per little section. So sensory memory is the initial momentary storage of info. So for the last only instant second. So for example, if you've ever asked a friend to tell you their phone number so you can write it down on a piece of paper or into your phone, right? What your parents asked you what you needed for the store, or a new song that you're listening to, but then you switch songs, or it's essentially it's like the doormat of getting into your house, right? So it uses our senses to take in info. It allows us to take in all info and decide its importance. So for example, if knowing my friend's number to put into the phone, it's not important until once it's in my phone, I no longer have to know it. So out it goes. My brain knows that I shouldn't pay attention to it because I don't need it in the long run, because we have phones that record contacts now. Back when I was a kid, we had landlines, and I had to memorize all my friends' phone numbers, but it was important, right? If info is not passed on, it is lost. It will slowly decay. So think of sensory memory as like a snapshot of what's happening right now, and it's constantly replaced with new snapshots. Unless you are directly trying to pay attention to every word I say, most likely this will be working in your sensory memory, and as you go over these notes, you're going to slowly start to encode it, right? So there's our sensory memory. And then step number 2 is our short-term, or what we call working memory, right? So this memory that holds meaningful info for short periods of time, usually less than like 30 seconds. It does have a limit. So usually if we're trying to chunk remember things, we can remember up to like either 7 numbers in a sequence. It's between 5 to 7 numbers, or 5 to 9 numbers, sorry. And we can store more information if it's chunked or grouped together. So for example, there's trying to remember PBS, FOX, CNN, ABC, CBC, but if we break it down into chunks, which we're going to learn about in a little bit, PBS, Fox, CNN, ABC, CBS, if we start to chunk things together, it is a way to help us to start to remember. So if we chunk information together, it's easier to remember than just random syllables, right? And we'll learn that in a little bit. And then we have long-term memory. This is the main goal for all of your studying. You want your information to be in long-term. This is where it needs to go. So this memory storage it stores information on a relatively permanent basis. Long-term memory doesn't have a limit. There's no file cabinet that will say, oh, all done, like brain, you can't take in anymore, right? So info in your long-term memory is filed and coded so we can retrieve it when needed. And we're going to talk about, in our retrieval section, how our brain does that, right? So there is a few problems with this model. So again, of course, there's going to be critics, right? But these are the top 3. So some information skips the first 2 stages and goes right into long-term memory. Okay, so for example, trauma. We're going to learn about flashbulb memories again. Very traumatic or high emotional events will automatically skip the sensory and working memory portion and go right to long-term, because your brain recognizes, especially if it's connected to emotions, it's easier to remember because it's stamped into your brain, okay? Number 2, since we cannot focus on all the sensory information in our environment, we selectively choose our information that is important to us, right? So this is why, so we have selective attention, right? So I can choose to focus on the fact that I have my awesome Diet Coke here, right? But I'm focusing on you guys, right? Our brains choose what to listen to due to our selective attention, right? And number 3, the nature of short-term memory is more complex than what they lead on, which is also why they are starting to add in this working memory model, okay? So working memory, kind of what is it, right? So it's a newer understanding of short-term memory. It involves conscious, active processing of incoming auditory, so what you're listening to right now, visual, and information retrieved from long term. So imagine working memory as a bunch of minions running back and forth from sensory memory to working memory to long term to back again. It's like a bunch of them always trying to encode more things. So imagine your working memory as a bunch of minions working from your working memory to your long term to try to retrieve. It's always working. So for my mnemonic for this, just imagine a bunch of minions running around and they're constantly trying to bridge that gap, right? So you can see here, so this is where the minions work. I would highly recommend copying this down. It is from your textbook. It's on page 329. So just a really quick recap, we have our external events, our sensory input, and then it automatically, so right now you guys have sensory memory. You can probably know what I've been talking about for the past few minutes, but that's just where it is at, right? So sensory memory has to be encoded. Working memory is constantly working to retrieve, encode, and all of that fancy stuff. But remember, if we've had a traumatic or like anything that has high emotions to it, it can be skipped through automatic processing right to long term. Okay, so for example, I didn't choose to remember 9/11. It just happened, right? It was a high traumatic event, and my brain understood that, and that's why I can remember it so well. I didn't even try to remember it so well because I was only, in elementary school at the time, right? I didn't know that I would be talking about it 20 years from now, but it was put automatically into my long-term memory due to the high stress of it, okay? All right, so encoding, right? So now getting information in, we have to be able to get information into our long-term memory, right? So we have to be able to encode it, right? To put the information into our brains. So there's two different ways you can think of this. There's some information like the route to your school, which is automatically processed. Your brain recognizes it's something it needs to know. So you pay more attention to it, right? However, new or unusual information like a friend's new cell phone number requires constant attention and effort in order for you to encode it, okay? So automatic processing, right? So what automatically gets processed without us really knowing? So an enormous amount of information is processed effortlessly without us even trying to. And these are three things that we constantly encode without really meaning to. So we encode space. So while reading a textbook, you automatically encode the places of pictures on a page. And people were asked to like redraw it, and people were able to know where the pictures were just because our brain naturally encodes the space of what we're looking at. Time, we unintentionally know when the events take place in a day. So I can remember really strong memories in my brain where it's like, oh, it was nighttime outside, or it was right after dinner. Our brain naturally processes where it was put within the day because it also helps us store it, right? Because we want to know what time it was so we can encode it. And also frequency. You effortlessly keep track of how often things that happen to you. So remember, if things happen to us, we are more likely to automatically encode them because we care about ourselves the most, right? In psych, we know that we're selfish beings and we care about what has to do with us, right? So if things affect us, we are more likely to automatically encode them quicker, right? Because we care about ourselves, right? So again, where were you when an accident occurred? Time when you woke up this morning, or at what point in the show that crazy thing happened, and then frequency, how many slices of pizza you had, or how many speeding tickets you have received. So these are all examples of what we automatically process that doesn't require any effort, okay? All right, and so here, the main point here is that automatic processing is that you don't have to recurse it to encode it. It just automatically happens, okay? All right, so effortful processing. So we just knew, so encoding, we just went over automatic encoding. Now we have to go over effortful processing. So in your notes, make sure you make a little difference where we just learned about automatic. Now we're learning about effortful processing, where we have to consciously study, right? So committing a novel information to memory requires a lot of effort, just like learning the concepts from this textbook, right? So such processing leads to durable and accessible memories. So what they say is effortful processing, where you study, it does have the highest rate of recall, because the more we consciously study something and retrieve it and encode it, we're more likely to be able to retrieve it with accuracy, okay, because we studied it. So let's go over kind of what that means, right? So memory effects, we have a few. So let me make sure I put them all out. So memory effects. So what happens? So these are a few phenomena that we notice when it comes to people's memories. And this is all with effortful memories, okay? Effortful processing. The next in line effect. When your recall is better for what other people say, but poor for a person just before you in line. So for example, thinking about when you had to read aloud in class, you're worried about when it's your turn to read. So the person right before you are way less likely to remember what they're saying because you're way too focused on what your part is next, right? So I remember doing that in class, and I remember like if Sally was right in front of me, like I was stressing the whole time rereading my own little section, right? So I don't mess up anything. So that's called the next in line effect. And then there's the spacing effect, where we retain information better when our rehearsal is distributed over time. I'm going to say that again for all my people who like to cram the night before a test. We all know who you guys are. It's okay. I've done it too. But it shows that our ability to recall is a lot better when we space our studying over a certain amount of time, okay? Our brain is able to process and encode shorter little chunks than long ones, especially if you're cramming and you're not sleeping. We all know that REM sleep is how our brain encodes memories, right? So little chunks. And then here, let me put my little example. So studies have shown that if you study a bit each night, you'll remember information better than if you cram for the test the night before. And then the serial position effect. I always like to call this like cereal, like kind of like eating cereal, because I call this the grocery list phenomenon. So when your recall is better for the first and the last items of a list, but poor for the middle. So let's try this one. Write down as many US presidents' names you can remember. Go. And if we were in class, a lot of people would remember the founding ones, and then like there'd be a huge gap, right? And then it's our like most like the ones that just happened, right? So for example, in class, I would say, okay, my people, like get out a piece of paper and I would read you guys a grocery list. And then most of the time you guys would remember the first few things, and then everyone would lose the middle. And then people would remember the last thing. So because I remember, I'm not letting you write it down until after I've said it. So again, we tend to remember the first and the last thing of a list, okay? And we have active and passive processing, right? So when you're actively processing, you are visualized like what you're trying to remember. You actively try to put it in your memory. Same can be said for studying. So think of active as when you study. You're actively trying to encode. But then there's also some people who passively try to encode, right? This is when you just try to memorize, like, for example, if you just try to, like for me, how I survived Spanish class was just memorizing vocab, but I failed at everything else because I just missed the syntax, right? Also, people who are passive, who just read over a text just to find the buzzwords to answer something, right? So if you're a passive studier, it means that you're usually distracted half the time too. So it's passive, right? So again, a little note at the bottom. Sorry, I have bubbles for my Diet Coke. Active is effortful, right? Passive is drawing strings and just sitting and observing, not really interacting, right? So if you've ever so it's kind of like reading through a book to find the buzzwords for the answers in your worksheet, right? Without really actually looking at the stuff, right? So active versus passive. And when we learn about rehearsal, we have to know about Ebbinghaus. He is the one who kind of went over this nonsense syllable phenomenon with rehearsal, where effortful learning usually requires a rehearsal or a constant repetition of something. So Ebbinghaus studied rehearsal by using nonsense syllables. So he tried to study how many people could remember nonsense syllables in a row. And what he found was as we rehearse more and more, and this is with nonsense syllables, right? It could be, and this is without having actual sentences, the more you rehearse, the less time you need to relearn it, right? So, I mean, everyone's like, Miss H, that's easy. But like, again, so usually for a test, if you like don't cram, you study a lot in the beginning, but as you start to learn more and more, you don't need to study the information as much because you're already retrieving it, right? So the more you study, the less time you need to repeat yourself or repetition for studying, right? So what we need to encode. So encoding by meaning. So these are 3 ways that we have the ability to encode. And the biggest one is meaning. We always use encoding for meaning. Encoding by images and encoding by organization. And again, this is what we encode, okay? What we encode. So when we talk about encoding meaning, it means that it's processing the meaning of verbal information by associating it with what we already know or imagine. So encoding meaningful results in better recognition later than a visual or acoustic encoding. So for example, we find that if we encode by using meaning, so for example, there's a reason that we use mnemonics, right, for our vocab, or try to find ways to make meaning of words, root words for different languages. It helps us remember and to encode it. So we encode using meaning, okay? We do visual encoding, where we use mental pictures of imagery that are a powerful aid to help us process. So for a lot of people who draw graphic organizers to kind of process their information through visuals, this is all you. A lot of people love visual encoding, right? So showing the adverse effects of tanning and smoking in a picture may be more powerful than simply just reading about it, right? So visual encoding has a big effect on us, right? So that's why on my PowerPoints, I try to have a mixture of both, right? Even though AP, we have a lot of words, my people, a lot of words. So a few effortful processing strategies. We have mnemonics. Mnemonics are key. So if we were in regular school right now, I would usually have you guys make your own flashcards, and you guys would have a mnemonic added to the end, which is just your way of trying to remember what the vocab means, okay? So it's it could be, so for example, working memory, my mnemonic for working memory is a bunch of minions running around, because that's how I make meaning of what the vocab is, right? So we also have, we organize information for encoding through 2 visual ways, right? Or two ways to break down complex information into broader concepts, and it's called chunking and hierarchies, okay? Chunking and hierarchies. These are ways to help us encode and organize information to encode. So chunking is exactly how you guys, just as how it sounds. It's how we organize items into a familiar, manageable unit. So in class, I would usually have you guys have a minute to try to just stare at the screen, see how many words, how many numbers you can remember, right? And you're gonna be like, oh gosh, I can't do it, right? But for the few people who caught on, these are all important dates that are chunked together, right? So instead of me saying, remember 1776149218121941, I could have you say, memorize 1776, 1492, 1812, and 1941, right? So we chunk because it helps us remember. There's a reason that we, if you've ever given your phone number to someone, you do the area code, you pause, the first 3, pause, and then the last 4, right? Because we know that chunking is an easier way to quickly encode information, right? And we also have chunking where we use acronyms, right? So to remember all the lakes, there's homes, ABCs, right? So the ABCs are acronyms, so A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I. So it's chunking to help us remember, right? And the last one for our first video is hierarchies. And these are so important. Like, I am a hierarchy person. This is why I love you guys doing graphic organizers, because it creates hierarchies to help you break down broad information into subgroups and subcategories for you to understand. So this is not the hierarchy I'm going to make you copy. The hierarchy I'm going to make you copy, and this is the last slide for our first video, is this. This is a summary of what we talked about with effortful processing. And we are going to talk about explicit memories next in our next video. But in order to effortful process, right, we talked about sensory memory, we talked about short-term and working, and effortful processing strategies, and we have chunking, mnemonics, and hierarchies. So I would love for you to copy this down in your notes, and I will see you for our next video. Hang in there.